Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. This is the place where you get both a coach's and sports dietitian perspective on topics important to endurance sports, including nutrition, training, and how these impact and fit into your daily life both on and off the race course. Your host, Coach Justin, certified run and triathlon coach and owner of Tabula Rasa Racing, along with Coach Katie, a registered dietitian with a specialty in sports nutrition and owner of Fuel to Run. Here at the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast is where your journey begins. Welcome, everyone, to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. I'm your host, Coach Justin. I'm here with Coach Katie. This is episode 14, all things hydration. And so I'm not going to give too much of an introduction to this. We're just going to get right in on this topic. We're just going to jump feet first into this pool. So I'm actually going to just take a little bit of a back seat. This is Katie's wheelhouse. So Katie, let's go ahead and we will start this topic and this conversation. Again, we're talking about hydration, all things hydration, electrolytes, water, fluid, what is going on chemically in our body, why we need it, when we need it. So Katie, we'll get rolling. So let's go.
I think I first of all want to say that I think this topic, you hear a lot about hydration and there is a lot already, kind of out there. And I think athletes are obviously aware of the importance of hydration. So hopefully today, I think the biggest goal I have is just kind of putting it all together and how to sort of figure out your own hydration needs and electrolyte needs and a little bit of a deeper dive into what all of that means and what, you hear words like hyponatremia and what that is and, how, when we're not hydrating well, what that does to performance. And so we want to sort of dig into that. But I think the most important thing I want to sort of address initially, and then we can dive in, is the difference between hydrating for the general population and athletes, because we're going to talk a lot about sodium and sweat sodium losses and other electrolytes as well. And I think that's a big difference. So obviously athletes are going to need more fluid because we're losing more. But I think we also need to really consider sodium and electrolytes and how we're adding those back in, because that's going to be really a big contributor to our overall hydration status and how well we're performing in general. So that's going to be a big topic today. And I also want to sort of kind of go back to a little bit of the history of why electrolytes are important and but also why I think people have avoided sodium. And then we can kind of dive in a little bit into more of the deep dive into how to calculate everything and why and things to consider before and after exercise and all that. But I think I think there's a lot of discussion because back in the 80s and 90s, I think there was a lot of athletes who kind of just drank water. There was a big shift of we're realizing hydration is really important, and people would drink a lot of water and not consume enough electrolytes. And there was a big risk of something called hyponatremia, which we'll dive into a little bit more. I also think that kind of what contributed to maybe I just think it's lack of science a little bit, lack of understanding of this is actually what facilitates hydration and that we need electrolytes. But I also think there is a lot of information that comes from the American Heart Association. I'm not saying that what they have to say is bad, because this is for general population, people who are not exercising, who maybe have health conditions, especially something like, heart disease or chronic heart failure or just stuff like that they're dealing with medical issues. It's probably not good for those people to overconsume sodium. And in general, there is a lot of research that correlates in that population of just general people or unhealthy people. There's a correlation between sodium and high blood pressure. So the American Heart Association says 2 grams or 2,000 milligrams of sodium or less a day is what they recommend. And I think a lot of athletes see that because it's kind of out there, right? Even if you look at the MyPlate recommendations for people, I think they mention sodium in there, the general healthy diet recommendations they put out, the government. It's just be careful about sodium. And I think athletes see that and they're like, oh, I shouldn't consume too much sodium. It's going to be bad for my health. And I just want you to remember that the research in this area is not on athletes. So when they're taking those recommendations, it's on people who are generally probably not exercising very much, and in some cases in a disease state in which they don't need much sodium. And so as athletes, we need to realize that we don't pay, that isn't applying to us in general, unless you are an athlete that also happens to have high blood pressure or some other medical condition. Then you may have to be a little more careful with what I'm going to say today. Like that may be one of those instances where you do have to work with like a nutritionist, although I do think that's helpful anyways. But you might want to have a little more caution. So, but for the general active person, healthy, active to very active person, someone that's probably listening to our podcast because they're doing endurance exercise, this is what we're talking to. So I think making that distinction is important, because I do think there is a lot of like fear. People are like sort of associating, oh, sodium is bad because I'm hearing this through these different channels, and that's not true for athletes in general.
Well, I think we made that same distinction when we talked about protein. With the protein consumption for endurance athletes, you really couldn't rely very much on, the dietary suggestions on what the research had showed, because the selection of people that they used in the study is not indicative of the population that we're interacting with, and these are athletes. So keep that in mind. Like Katie was saying, it's like when you start and you look at the research, you have to kind of keep that in mind on who they're actually describing, and you have to say, well, am I in that pool of people where they've made these generalizations? Is it indicative of my lifestyle? And I would argue that the concept, like the idea of sugar, sugar has probably been given the same kind of, I don't want to say bad rap as salt has. And
probably right. Yeah, it's true.
That's one thing that I would like to talk about in this episode is the role of sugar in the delivery of electrolytes. And so, salt is salt and sugar. These things are not necessarily bad.
Right. Yeah.
Now, keeping in mind that moderation, there's still the concept of moderation. So if all you eat is sugar and salt, yes, that's bad. But still, I don't think that it's stuff that we should stay away from. And I think because we've stayed away from it, we're probably leaving performance on the table.
Yeah, it's about context a little bit, like, or just why, when we're very active, we're losing those things, right? We're burning through glucose. We're losing sweat through our sodium through our sweat. And we need to replace those things in order to be able to perform. Versus when we're sedentary, our body isn't really, we're not sweating a whole lot unless maybe you don't have air conditioning or you're outside working or there's certain circumstances you probably, okay, sure. But it's like if you're sedentary, you're not burning through much carbs either.
Right.
You're really not using a whole lot of carb. And so you don't really need sugar at all. Like, most of the time for someone sedentary, shouldn't probably consume sodas and things like that because you're just causing a huge load on your body with blood sugars increasing and things like that. It's just not very good for us. When we're moving and active, our body is using that carb and it's losing sodium because we're losing it through sweat and we're using it. It's being used, and then we need more of it. We need to replace that. So it's like the concept of thinking about it that way is important too. So yes, and that's why I think when you hear those things like sodium is bad or don't consume too much sodium or salt or like sugar is bad for you, don't like sugar is evil, it kind of pisses me off a little because it's like not necessarily in all contexts is it evil, and we do need it, especially active people, especially while you're exercising in order to perform well. So I do kind of get a little bit irritated. I get some of the thought behind it because if you're totally not active and you're just sitting on the couch, you don't need to be consuming sugar, right? Really.
Yeah.
And, I don't want to say like having an indulgence here or there is bad, but it's just mostly like probably really don't need it. And so I think that's just a distinction is like, that's what makes athletes a little bit different. And that's why athletes need to be a little bit careful about those generalized recommendations. Because even the plate model that you see is totally different for athletes. Like if I was going to work with an athlete, what their plate may look like is not going to be what the general recommendations are for the American public, right? Because we have different needs. So just remembering that and trying to take your, like, not be so focused on, especially maybe what you're hearing in the media and influencers and just general people that are talking about health and things like that. They probably aren't talking about athletes and active people in general, so, or very active people. So I think that's important. And it kind of goes for a lot of different things when it comes to different, not only macronutrients, but micronutrients, and which also includes our electrolytes because those are considered micronutrients. But
Well,
so
now,
let's say,
now that we introduced the word electrolytes, I like that you
right,
just did that. So let's define what electrolyte means.
exactly,
So
yeah,
I think that's a really important idea that we have to set that context early in this episode so that people understand, well, what do we mean by electrolytes? Because it's not just sodium. So
hmm
there's other nutrients that are wrapped up in the electrolyte category. So let's talk about that.
yeah. So we talk a lot today. It's going to be a lot about sodium and salt because when we're sweating, that is a huge amount that we're losing. The most of our, like, the biggest portion of the electrolytes that we're losing is coming from sodium or salt. So I mean, I'll talk a little bit about how much that might be. It really varies a bit. And then we also have potassium, magnesium, calcium, chloride. I mean, there's different like those are the biggest ones that we're losing. So a lot of times sodium is coming, like you'll get sodium chloride as the component of sodium, but it's those are the electrolytes that we're like losing through our sweat. However, like I said, sodium is going to be the largest component. That's why we talk about that a lot, but we also do lose the others. So what we want to keep in mind is when you're looking at replacing electrolytes, I think it's kind of nice to have like some of those pre-made electrolyte supplements. Like I mentioned, if you like Noon, Ultima, Element, LMNT, Relight, there's a bunch out there that kind of have a pretty good amount of like sodium, and then they also contain some potassium and a little bit of magnesium, calcium, so that's all kind of in there together. But you'll notice the largest amount is coming from sodium. I have also seen some out there that are like really high in potassium. I can't remember the name of it, but I've seen it. It's like really high potassium and relatively low sodium. That's not going to be a good option because we're not losing that much potassium. We are losing some. Probably the second largest amount we lose is from potassium, but it's not going to be nearly as much as sodium. So you need to be looking for some sort of electrolyte replacement that the majority is coming from sodium, and then maybe there's a little bit of the others in there. And that's also why sometimes, we are losing magnesium. Are like the potassium we do get a lot from the foods we eat, so we'll replace that too. But that's why sometimes athletes need a little more magnesium, and so sometimes taking an additional magnesium supplement isn't a bad idea. But in terms of what's going to have the biggest impact on our hydration status and fluid balance in the body, it's probably really going to be the big two would be sodium and then maybe potassium, because they're just the ones that we're losing the more of. But I think I want to mention that because I think you're just going to hear a lot about sodium, and that doesn't mean that those other electrolytes shouldn't be in there or aren't important. But I think it's just looking at some of the products out there, if you want to use something like that to help with hydration, just finding one that's got a pretty good amount of sodium and then a little bit of the others. You don't have to be super concerned about the exact amounts and whether it's perfect or not, because you're getting those from other sources as well. But yeah, I think that's a good question, something
But
to distinguish.
it does play a significant role, those other nutrients, when it comes to long course racing. If
Yeah.
we're talking about something that is like half Ironman to full Ironman, something that can last anywhere between 6 hours to 13 hours, like 12 to 13 hours, those other nutrients, while
Oh, yeah, they matter.
relative to sodium may not be as important, but something of that kind of duration matters.
Yeah, that's why I would probably recommend choosing a replacement that also has those others electrolytes in there and not just kind of creating your own, because you can just create one with some juice and water and maybe some salt, just kind of create your own replacement, but that is kind of leaving behind potentially some of those other electrolytes. So you wouldn't maybe want to do your own concoction like that unless you have found a way to do it, also replacing potassium and magnesium and calcium in some way for your race. You would probably want to rely on some other option that has them in there. You know what I mean? So you're not
Yeah.
like depleting those as well. But I don't want people to be like, oh, well, what's the exact amount? Like, oh no, like it's going to be terrible. I'm going to lose, I'm going to have like some sort of negative consequence. And what's the perfect amount? Like it may depend a little bit on the individual. And so I don't want you to get too, especially when we're talking about sodium, I'm going to give some recommendations, but I don't want you to get thinking like, oh, it's got to be perfect. I've got to have this perfect formulation, exactly what I need every hour. And it's going to have to be perfect. Like, oh, I've got to like figure this out. And there's going to be some sort of calculation for every electrolyte. And, that unfortunately, it just doesn't work like that because there's so many things that can impact how we're absorbing those nutrients and what we need in terms, even with how hot it is or what the humidity is, and it could get like so complicated. So I don't want people to be worrying about it. I just think, okay, making sure that you are basically finding a product, like first calculating sodium needs and then finding a product that also probably has those other electrolytes is going to be probably adequate. So don't worry too much. Yeah.
All right. So you just said an important word that I want to use as a transition, and it's absorption.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about what is going on. Why do we've talked about kind of like what the electrolyte is, and in broad terms, we've said, hey, we're losing these nutrients, mainly salt and sodium, through sweat. One distinction that I would like to make, though, is sometimes it is hard to use a visual observation of sweat to determine how much you're losing.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that I say this is that I work with swimmers, and I'm a swimmer as part of a triathlete. We're in the pool, so we can't observe sweat because we're already wet. So I think one of the things that I would like to mention is that not necessarily sweat, because anytime there's an elevated heart rate, I think that we can safely assume that the body is doing something to combat that elevated heart rate. Because when the heart rate rises, the temperature, our body core temperature, starts to rise as well. And then the body has mechanisms that start to trigger once that core temperature starts to rise.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly why we sweat, right?
So we've talked about this before,
down.
The whole mechanism on like what causes us to sweat. So, but I want to make sure that I bring this out. So if there's any kind of like long course triathlete that's out there that's training for probably like a full Ironman is probably definitely relevant, because you can start to get into some 4K and 5K swims during your peak training. And if you're only taking water to the pool deck for a session that's like that, you might want to consider taking an electrolyte mix with you rather than that, because you can't rely on sweat as an indication of how hard that you're working and how much you need to drink. So
not only that, but when it's dry out, like here in Colorado, I could lose a significant amount of sweat, and it's just drying so quickly because it's dry. Whereas when it's humid, you feel it a lot more because you're like, wow, I'm like drenched in sweat. And then you're maybe more like, yeah, I've lost a significant amount, and it's more visual. Whereas in the pool, or when it's very dry, or even like riding your bike, because you're in the wind and there's a lot of factors there, it's wicking the sweat away a little bit quicker generally. You're just not going to maybe be able to have any indication or idea how much you lose. And I think that's an important point. Because you could be losing a lot. And in the water, especially like when you're swimming, it doesn't feel like it because you're in the water. And I think, like you said, it could, and you're losing sweat. So you're still losing sweat, you know, because it may be different if the water is cooler, obviously, those factors. But I think, we could talk about kind of how to calculate that a little bit, but I think that's an important thing to mention is like, you can't just use like your own subjective feelings of, how much water? I don't know. Like I can give you some general ideas for like hydrating just generally, I think the very general, recommendations are just to consume like, this is from maybe like the general sports nutrition books that you have to consume like 20 ounces of water fluids a few hours before, 1 to 2 hours before, and then 10 ounces every like 8 to 10 ounces every 10 to 20 minutes, right? That's just general.
Yeah.
I guess that's for somebody who's just starting out, and then maybe to consume, they say 24 ounces for every pound of weight loss. Well, that means you would have to be calculating that, right?
Yeah.
And like you would have to know like how many pounds. And that kind of brings up that point of like, actually, I do think it's important to sometimes or occasionally actually do that calculation. And it's a bit tedious because you have to have a scale and you probably want to ideally like weigh yourself minimally clothed or totally naked before you so you'd have to do this if you're going to be in the pool. This is where it gets a little tricky is you would have to do that before you go. So that's for, before you get in the pool. And then, so maybe with your swimsuit on, but maybe not, because I mean, that adds a little bit of weight. And then you get in the water and you have to basically do your workout. So anything between 45 minutes to 2 hours is probably ideal for this sort of calculation. And then when you get out, you have to weigh yourself again. And so but you have to make sure you're like toweling all, because any additional fluid that's still in your hair, even you you don't have to be like super nitpicky about it, but trying to dry yourself off as much as possible and then weigh yourself again in the same conditions, as you did before to try to get an idea of how much weight you're losing during. And all of that weight you lose during exercise is all coming from fluid. It's not mass at all. Like you're not losing 3 pounds of general weight, body mass in that exercise. So it's going to be all fluid. And then you want to also somehow add in, like if you take in fluid during, you want to make sure and it gets tricky because if you pee or have to get out and pee, there's a volume. I don't know I don't know how you would calculate that unless you have like some way of measuring your pee. That gets weird, but you know what I mean? I'm like, I don't know, but sometimes I'm in my run and I have to pee and I'm like, okay, well, how am I going to measure that? So it gets a little tricky, but you have to kind of do your best. But that gives you a general idea of how much weight you're losing during exercise. And then you can kind of calculate your fluid needs based off that. So you would basically take, like, let's say you lost 3 pounds and then you have to divide. So I always think kind of in kilograms, it's a little bit easier. You divide that by 2.2 and let's say it's like something around 1.5 kilograms. And then that 1 kilogram equals about a liter. So then you can kind of get an idea. Okay, 1.5 liters plus I drank, a few liters. And then you can add that all together and you get basically like a total amount of fluid that you need for that exercise. So I'm going to create a blog article too that kind of goes along with this, that I'll outline that so you don't have to be like writing notes down if you want to check that out. But basically you're just sort of trying to figure out how much fluid am I losing. That doesn't include sodium. That's just the fluid piece. Right. And you would want to probably do this for various different types of exercise. So that would be the pool example, but you probably want to do it for your ride and your run because the sweat rate will be a little bit different in each of those situations. Ideally, you would also maybe want to do it on a cooler day versus a hotter day, but you can see where it gets a little bit, time consuming a little bit, or just like, okay, this, but then you can have an idea, okay, generally this is how much fluid I might be losing through each of these conditions. And then that gives you an idea also when you go into a race based off, is it going to be a hot day or is it going to be a cooler day? This is generally how much fluid I might be expecting to lose during the swim and the bike and the run. And then you can kind of generally have an idea for how much fluid you need to be replacing during, right? And so it can be really helpful. Otherwise, if you're just sort of like, I'm relying on thirst, that's a bad way to do it because by the time you're thirsty, it's too late. You're probably already dehydrated. You don't want to, I think the thing here too is you don't want to overhydrate either. So if you're really thirsty, that's probably dehydrated. But, and the flip side of this is if you're so worried about dehydrated that you're just drinking a lot, then you can also be overhydrated. So it's like sometimes using these calculations is helpful because then you kind of have a better idea and you can get that balance correct without going in either direction. Because I do think, although most athletes tend to be maybe slightly underhydrated, there are some that are drinking like a gallon of water a day, like just so much fluid, and they're maybe even risking overhydration. So there is that too. I mean, we want to be a little bit careful not to totally be like, oh, I don't want to ever be dehydrated. I'm going to drink like all day long and overdo it. But I think just doing that sweat rate is helpful, is a great way to kind of just have a general idea. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that kind of addresses that question because you're right. There's no way to really know how much you're losing, especially in the pool.
So I guess one of the things that we can say is that if you're sedentary, you're fine just drinking water, right? But I think once you start to introduce activity into it, and it's the loss of the sodium, potassium, magnesium, and the other nutrients. It makes the absorption of fluid more difficult. And so what I'd like to talk about is, why do we care about electrolytes? Why don't we just say, look, this is just way too complicated. I'm just going to drink water. So if we have athlete A who is doing, let's say, a half marathon or a half Ironman, and their nutrition strategy is pure water, nothing added to it, just straight up water. And then you have athlete B who has not just water, but an electrolyte mix. I would argue that athlete B is going to be the better performer.
Better hydrated.
All things held constant, assuming that they have similar fitness and, similar equipment and so forth. So let's talk about why we should care about electrolytes in terms of fluid absorption.
Yeah, so electrolytes can help facilitate absorption of the water into our body. So like just getting it from the gut into our bloodstream and throughout the body. And then it also can facilitate the actual balance of the fluid in our cells. So sort of the, even if you go back to that basic science, science classes where they talked about osmolarity, this is why it's important to kind of try to get a pretty good balance, making, but not being perfect, but just trying to figure out what amount of sodium you generally may need at exercise. Do you want to overdo it or underdo it? Because basically, if you think about it, it's kind of like at the cellular level, if there's like a concentration, let's say there's a lot of sodium that kind of gets into the cell, then you can have this like sodium, like this concentration gradient of like fluid inside or outside the cell based off how much sodium is inside or outside the cell. It's just a little bit hard to like sometimes understand. I think it was just kind of, I wrote down like an analogy here, but so if the fluid outside our cell has a higher osmolarity, so basically more particles, so maybe in this case, like there's a lot of sodium hanging out outside the cell, the water will actually leave the cell. In this case, I was also thinking of it as like a balloon, but then the cell, it kind of like shrinks. The fluid is kind of outside, and then the inside is more constant, like the water outside, like, so there's not enough. I got that right. Now I'm like, this is why it's so hard, right? I'm like,
I know. It's not easy.
Okay, so the fluid on the outside has a higher osmolarity, so there's more particles out. So that means like the fluid will leave the cell, and then the cell will be like kind of dehydrated, I guess. And then on the flip side of that, if there's the fluid on the outside, there's a lot more fluid on the outside of the cell, and there's more particles inside, like a lot more sodium in the cell. The sodium will kind of go into the cell and it swells. And so it's like what we want to try to maintain is this balance of fluid inside and outside of our cells. And so the sodium can help with that. But as you can see, like you could also see the flip side of that is maybe if we really overdid sodium, it could be bad because we might have too much. Then the cells would be like, maybe the fluid balance would then not be correct. And we want to sort of maintain that. The other thing we want to think about with sodium and the other, and potassium especially, is that it also is like electrical signaling. So our heartbeat, things like that are reliant on electrical signaling is also reliant on having that right amount of sodium. So that's not talking about absorption. That's just one of the other reasons we want to be aware of this, because that's one of the dangers of hyponatremia, or not consuming enough sodium. And so it's just about like so kind of going back to what you're asking, it's the facilitation of the fluid into the body, and then that balance of fluid within the cells. So sometimes if we consume a lot of water without the sodium, it kind of gets in, like we might absorb some of it, or maybe not, but we'll probably absorb it. I mean, it just may be a slower rate of absorption. And then once it's in the body, it may not actually be getting adequately into the cells. Like it may actually just I think I've experienced this where I've consumed a ton of water and not a lot of like just water. And I just have to pee like constantly. And yeah, my pee might be real clear but it's almost as if I feel still quite dehydrated, or I'll still go out for a run and I'm like, God, I feel like my legs are heavy and I'm a little bit bloated, or almost like not edema, but I can feel the fluid almost like there's some sort of retention of fluid or or even just this, I think most people kind of felt that, like almost like there's something off but I'm peeing and it's all clear and everything otherwise seems like I should be hydrated. And that's likely just because it's going sort of right into my bloodstream and it's being filtered out. It's not actually maybe all of that water I'm consuming anyways. I'm sure some of it is getting into the cell, but it's not. It's just kind of just going through and then being filtered out by the kidneys, and I'm just peeing a bunch. And so I think that's more important for athletes because we probably just need more fluid in general. So the more you can kind of facilitate that, both the absorption more quickly into the body and then facilitate the actual uptake of the fluid into the cells and making sure that that fluid balance is correct in our cells, then we're just going to be a little bit more hydrated, and therefore we're going to have that actual fluid going into where it needs to go essentially. And then it'll help with performance because we'll have our cells and
Yeah.
everything will be, our muscle cells, everything will be properly hydrated. So that's kind of how way I think of it. But that doesn't mean that every single fluid you consume has to contain sodium or electrolytes. It's just the rate of absorption. You'll still likely absorb it, and it's not like none of that water is just going right through you. None of it's being like contributing to hydration. It's just that you want to facilitate that a little bit better and make sure. I think the sodium kind of helps with that hydration balance. And so using that to our advantage is helpful. So someone that's sedentary, I'm not saying that maybe having some electrolytes in their drink, I mean, a very minimum amount would be helpful, but they just don't need, they're not as worried about dehydration. And because they're not so active, they don't have the same amount of need for water and fluids as an athlete. So they're probably going to be just fine, especially because they're eating electrolytes. So also thinking about it, they're probably having some in their food. They're probably getting that facilitation of fluid balance just through that. It's not like everybody needs to be drinking water with electrolytes. But I do think for an athlete, it might be helpful to consider not only having the electrolytes sort of during the exercise, which is most important, but also sort of maybe thinking about it in terms of daily hydration. And this is where I think it's just, you don't have to get super crazy about it. But like what I do is I have like my water bottle, just for example, I have like this big Yeti. I don't know how many ounces are in here, but I'll take the water and then I'll just put, I use Element. I mean, I don't get any money from them or
Yeah.
I just like that product. I put a little bit in, just a tiny bit in that water, like maybe a quarter of a packet. I don't really even measure it specifically because I don't have time for that, but I just put, and it just like, it gives it some flavor and I can kind of get that little bit of electrolyte in there, but it's not like, unless it's a very hot day or I've done a ton of exercise, I don't always put like a full packet in there, and I'll sip on that. And I might do a couple of those a day. And maybe I'm adding a little bit to other fluids throughout the day. And then I'm definitely having some in my water when I'm exercising, but just kind of some sort of daily hydration. Like Scratch has like a daily hydration mix. That's just like for daily hydrating. That's perfect. Something like that. It's not super high. It's just got a little bit. It'll help facilitate some of that hydration. So just kind of thinking of it that way, of like maybe adding something to your water just to kind of help with that might be a wise thing to do, especially when it's really hot outside and you're losing a lot of fluid. So I don't know if that answered. That was a lot.
Yeah. So
long-winded.
what I kind of want to do is I want to try and explain then what I've heard, because if I can explain it, then that means that I understand it.
Right.
And
absolutely,
so if we can think of salt then as similar to like a straw in a glass. So if the cell in our body, like the cells that make up our body, if the proportion of salt in the cell is higher than the proportion of salt in the fluid surrounding the cell, then that salt that's in the cell is going to draw fluid from the body into the cell. But if the salt concentration is greater on the outside of the cell, then it's going to pull fluid from the cell, which is not what we want.
Neither one of those situations is really great, right?
Okay, so that's why the balance is so important, so that the fluid within the cell and the fluid surrounding the cell remains in balance.
I think that's
is that right?
Where, yeah, exactly, because that's where I think the risks of either high sodium concentrations or low, or hyponatremia, which means low sodium, that's where it can get risky because you then have in either of those situations, you kind of have this imbalance of sodium in the cell outside the cell, and then it kind of creates that issue. Or if we're even dehydration can kind of contribute to that a little bit because we don't even have enough fluid in that case. But it's mostly in that situation of, thinking about it like if let's take hypo because it's more common. It's very unusual for an athlete to actually have hypernatremia or high sodium. Think about it. Unless you're like, because even when I drink my electrolytes in my water, it's too much of that in my water. It's just like, yeah, like having a whole stick of that element and like it's just so much for me, right? It's like hard to do. You could maybe do it if you were doing like tablets that you were swallowing and they were 250 milligrams each and you were just downing those, or those chewable ones or something. But it's hard, I think, for athletes to overdo it. It's possible if they're doing that and not drinking enough fluid, yes. But I think more commonly athletes have hyponatremia, meaning they're drinking way too much fluid and way too little sodium and other electrolytes.
Yeah.
And so what tends to kind of happen in that scenario is that now you have in your blood there's a lot of fluid and not enough electrolytes. So then you have this situation where maybe the cells are a little bit higher. So it's like the cells actually kind of draw in.
Yes.
Because the actual surrounding tissue is very low in sodium, then the cells kind of take up the sodium or the fluid. I'm sorry, and then there's this whole like the cell sick that's happening now. We don't have enough of that balance, and there's this whole the cells are now getting very kind of fluid overloaded. I guess like it's just like
makes sense,
causing what I mean. I'm like going back to like the low sodium. I was like. So it's the action potential process, I guess is what it is when it's that balance of like the sodium and the potassium and the electrical signaling, right? But then also that contributes to muscle cramping too. So although muscle cramping isn't always electrolytes, it can be reducing coordination. So those are all things. But I think at the very, very most dangerous part is that cell swelling. So the swelling, the fluid going into the cell. And I think that's where, especially in the brain, and I think this is where it really is dangerous, is when this is happening in the brain and people can die from it, essentially. There's people that have died from hyponatremia doing Ironmans and other endurance exercises. This is luckily less common now, but it happens a lot like these 90s, in 1980s, 90s. And so this is kind of exactly what's happening is there's this loss of that balance, and then the cells are swelling, and that can be very, very dangerous, especially in the brain, and people die, have seizures, stuff like that. And actually I had a gentleman who I worked with after I think I mentioned this before, it was after he had participated. I didn't work with him before, but he was doing the Ironman Cozumel in Mexico, and he did not take in any electrolytes. He actually told me, I don't think he took in very many or any, and after the race, I don't even think he completed it. I'm not sure, but he was sent to the emergency room and nearly died because he had hyponatremia and it was so severe. Saved his life, but it's scary. So that's more, I think what I'm trying to point out here is that like it's possible to have too much, but more commonly it's that athletes maybe aren't getting enough in it. And generally, if we have too much, it generates thirst, So like our body has some mechanisms. So if we're taking in a lot, we just get a lot more thirsty. And you might then have a tendency to then want to just drink pure water because your body's telling you like, oh, we got a little too much sodium. It just generates a lot of thirst. There's some mechanisms there, but sometimes we don't always notice the symptoms of like low levels of sodium until it's too late because you might be feeling these things like reduced coordination, things like that, but it may be like you're just not noticing it until it's too late. Sometimes nausea is the first sign. Or if you're very nauseous, there's other things that contribute to that, but that could be a sign that you're under consuming electrolytes. But I think more commonly when we are overdoing it, we have these like thirst mechanisms and things that kind of prevent us from potentially overdoing it, continuing to overdo it. And so I'm really more concerned about athletes just not getting enough, if that makes sense. And those are just to outline some of the reasons why that's so concerning, obviously.
Which makes sense because if you're drinking fluid that doesn't have the sodium within it, and all you're drinking is just pure water, then it creates this imbalance at the cell level where the water outside of the cell has less salt than the cell itself. And so the sodium that's within the cell draws the water from the surrounding cell, and it causes the cell to swell.
Well, yeah.
So it makes sense that you're really not absorbing fluid.
Yeah, it's just kind of in the
Which is why you can drink and drink and drink, and all you do is just pee it out because the body isn't absorbing it.
And this is an important thing to remember too, is that when we are taking in more than our body can filter out too, because our body does a pretty good job generally. Like this is why like hyponatremia is possible outside of my son. I'm sorry.
He's all good.
Okay, he's like yelling for his dad, and I don't know if people can. Oh, sorry about that. No, but this is so now I'm like lost my concentration. Sorry. So this is why I think like in general people who are not working out, if you drink a lot of fluid all throughout the day, I mean it's possible you could kind of have some minor hyponatremia. Like if you go and get a blood test too, there's ways to sort of determine this. Like you'll see like if your sodium concentration is like 135 milligrams per deciliter, I think, or less, like it's lower than that, sometimes that can indicate that your sodium levels are too low. So you can, go get a lab draw and kind of get some idea of that. But like in general, like the body, unless you're really like just drinking gallons, like you're just the fluid overloading yourself all day. Like, yes, it's possible for someone who isn't active to have this happen to them. It's not like impossible, but our body generally for just drinking fluids throughout the day is pretty good about filtering. The problem is when we're exercising and we're taking in fluid and we're losing a lot through sweat, and there's a lot going on. Like the mechanism for that balance is like maybe not going to be the same, or we're just we're in an exercise situation. We're just like drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking, and there's not enough sodium. The body's mechanism of being able to like get rid of that through pee is not going to be able to keep up, and so then it kind of becomes a little bit, and all the actual balance is the issue too. So it's more so probably going to happen during exercise because we're losing so much sweat through sweat. So we're taking in so much water and losing so much more through sweat. And it's this like huge problem because in general, when you're just sitting there, you're not losing that much sodium, really. You know what I mean? You're not really at all. And the body has a way too, in the kidneys, there's a hormone called aldosterone that kind of, depending on if we have a lot of salt and fluid coming in or little, that hormone will fluctuate, and it either helps the kidneys absorb more sodium or lose less of it, and more fluid or lose less, so it's like depending on the situation our body's in, that hormone will increase or decrease to kind of facilitate the release of fluid and or electrolytes, or help us retain them if we're like not sensing we're not having enough. So there is some like really just like remembering in general, unless excessive things are happening and our body's not able to keep up, just having that faith that our body is actually incredible at keeping all of this stuff in equilibrium, as long as we're not in any excess or like too little or too much. So don't be sitting there and being like, oh no, like I don't want to die. Like as long as we'll talk a little bit about sodium needs and kind of how to address that here in a minute, and how to kind of basically calculate generally maybe how much you need. Don't sit there and be like, oh no, like I'm going to have this happen. I don't want to die, and then maybe overdo it or spend hours trying to figure this out. It's just having a little faith in our body too, is good. So if you do happen to take a little more sodium than you need, or a little more fluid than you need, the body will get, will address it. But it's just in these extreme cases that it really becomes a problem. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, one of the things that you said earlier, and this was a while back, is that the potassium and magnesium is it essentially the carrier of the electrical signal? So it conducts it. So the reason that it's important is because we're athletes, and muscle contraction is at its basis is simply just an electrical signal from the brain that tells the muscle to contract. So if there is an imbalance of the magnesium and potassium within our blood,
Yeah.
then the signals don't get delivered from the brain to the
Yeah.
muscle, which is a
And that's could
performance
be why a
inhibitor to a
cramp
certain extent.
could
Yes.
happen because you might have this imbalance there too, and so then the muscle may cramp up, and yeah, so that is important too. So that's why we want to address this. So if you're someone that's chronically prone to like cramping a lot, like especially in those long duration activities, if you're just like, well, I'm constantly cramping, I do think it's important to address this and try to figure out because it's challenging sometimes. Cramping can be that, and it can also be a nerve sort of situation where maybe like the muscles are getting tired and this I get a lot of cramping sort of at the end of my marathon, and I've tried to really address this. I've, you know, trying to figure out is it sodium? Is it electrolytes? And I just think for me, in some cases, because it never ends up in a full on cramp, like it's just this feeling like I'm going to get a cramp. I think part of it is just that by this point at the end of 26 miles, I've been going as hard as I can for 26, whatever, 23 miles already. And my body, my muscles are just getting tired. And it's more of a
Yeah.
nerve signaling thing, or like there's stuff going on there that maybe isn't always electrolyte related. So I think when we're having cramping, I think first kind of sort of looking at the fluid and the electrolytes and saying, okay, is this something that could be contributing? Maybe I'm going to dive into this a little bit, do some of these calculations, maybe do some testing to see if I am a salty sweater or high salt sweater or low salt sweater, what's going on here, and then addressing that. And then if you're like, well, I don't know, it seems like I'm good there, maybe addressing some of the other potential contributors to cramping, but it is definitely something that can contribute to muscle cramps. So it's worth like digging into, especially if you're prone to cramping a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a distinction that I wanted to make because sometimes, these products can be pricey. And if we're training a lot and we're consuming a lot of these products, it can get expensive. And I completely understand that and completely respect it. So sometimes there's this desire to kind of like create your own kind of like electrolyte
Right.
drink, which is
Right.
essentially what I think people would probably do is they would have water and maybe throw in like a little bit of Crystal Light for flavor and then just add salt to it, thinking that that's all they have to be concerned about. But
Right.
they're missing the other pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
And I think it's the magnesium and the potassium. So if you're having, it's important, so when it comes to, carrying these electrical signals from our brain to our muscles, just kind of ignoring them and kind of brushing them off might be detrimental to the whole, to what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where it's important to like maybe do some of the testing to figure out what you need. So if you're worried about the cost, you can kind of figure out, oh, well, this is kind of what I need. And so you're not overusing the products, too much. And I think for exercise, maybe relying on the products, but in terms of the daily hydration, like you don't like, you could probably create your own thing, for just like, okay, I'm going to create my own little concoction for just something that's going to keep me hydrated during the day. And that could include a little bit of juice and a little, but juice is high in sugar, so you want to be careful. But the Crystal Light thing and a little bit, I'm just going to throw out a little bit of sodium in there, and it'll still help facilitate that hydration piece. But when you're exercising, because you're losing those other electrolytes a lot more through sweat too, that's where you maybe want to rely on some of the products. So maybe just thinking about when are you using the products and when, like, okay, I can't afford to have Element and just drinking that all the time. It's a lot. It's kind of expensive. I know that because I even do like the full box of it, and I order it every, I don't know, 3 or 6 months or whatever. And it's like $100 and some for that. And doesn't seem like much for that time frame, but it can be for somebody, who is on a budget. So it's just try to think about, okay, in this context, when I'm exercising, maybe I'll use the product. And then outside of that, maybe make your own little, drink mix concoction. So that's
reasonable.
That's how I would do it. Yeah, that's because you don't need to worry so much. And you can also, I mean, you're getting, like I said, potassium comes in the fruits and vegetables we eat have a lot of potassium. So consuming lots of fruits and some veggies, you'll get that. And then, maybe you could take like a magnesium supplement and that'll kind of cover that throughout the rest of the day. So you don't have to be as worried about it in that context. Just while you're exercising, you may want to have a more precise, like some of those products. And I know a lot of those products are pricey and you know, like, so you just want to make sure it's simple. You don't have to have a product that's really expensive that has like all sorts of other things in it that we don't need. Like, I don't know, I can't think of one, but I'm sure there are some out there that are like, oh, it's got all these other ingredients that maybe other nutrients, maybe like, I don't know, like maybe it has like vitamin C or something. Like, you don't need that while you're
Yeah.
exercising. So don't pay more for something that seems really fancy. Just the basics, just something that's replacing those electrolytes. And maybe in some cases, something that maybe has a little bit of sugar, because that's the other thing too, especially when we're exercising.
Yeah.
The sugar can also help facilitate that absorption, and that plus and it's hard because it really depends on the concentration. Again, this kind of goes back to the osmolarity. If we have like a ton of sugar and a ton of sodium and it's a very concentrated amount in our gut, and then we're doing and we're taking in, let's say, like goos, and then we take in a bunch of salt tablets, like a bunch all at once, and we don't have a lot of fluid to go along with that, it can actually draw fluid from outside the body into the gut. And that's
Mm.
sometimes where people have problems, right? Or they have diarrhea or something like that, and that's
Yeah.
never good. So you have to be a little bit aware that it kind of depends a little bit, but you want to make sure, if you're having like a drink mix or something, you want to be aware of concentration and also consuming fluid, making sure that the fluid intake is adequate. And then that does help, that concentration, a little bit of sodium, a little bit of carb can help facilitate actually the water going into the body. But it can also, in too concentrated amounts without enough fluid, cause the opposite. So
Yeah.
so we want to be,
So I think
I think
I
some,
think a good rule of thumb then is just to look at the ingredients on the
mhm.
electrolyte powders or mixes that you're using. And I think in general, the fewer ingredients,
Yeah,
the
the more
better. And
simple,
that's a
yeah.
fairly simple like
Like,
general
just
rule of
look
thumb.
for
As long as you
sodium,
see
potassium,
sodium,
yeah,
magnesium, and potassium
and maybe a little
in
bit
that
of
ingredient
calcium is
list,
okay, yeah.
you're sweet.
You're good, yeah, and you don't need, and if it's one that has a little sugar in there too, but you just wanna be careful. It's not, like, it does like, that's why you test it out, right? Like,
Yeah.
some products are very high sugar and they have a little bit of electrolytes, and so you wouldn't wanna then maybe take that and add a ton of electrolytes to that, because it could be just a lot of concentration in your gut. You might wanna take that and then a little bit of water with that or something, and then take your electrolyte drink maybe 10, 15 minutes later, kinda, like, space it out a little bit so you're
Yeah.
allowing your gut to be able to absorb things and not overwhelm the gut with too much high concentration of, like, sodium and carbs or sugar, and then cause the opposite problem. So it's sometimes just about, like, thinking it through, like, okay, I'm gonna take my high carb drink mix, and maybe some additional fluid, and that does have sometimes some electrolytes. And then I'm going to after I've sort of give that a minute, maybe 10 minutes, I'm going to try to drink some of my water with the electrolyte mix in it. And you're just sort of spacing it out a little bit. That's probably the best way to go. I know that does take some thought, but we
I
just want to
like
be
that.
aware of
Yeah.
that.
I like that you brought up sugar because the way that I kind of understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that because I see a lot of posts on people that are trying to get into running or endurance sports, and they're like, I need to be sugar free, and it kind of makes me cringe a little bit because I think sugar's getting this bad rap, and the way that I kind of understand it is the role of sugar is the sugar is what carries the sodium, magnesium, and potassium, the electrolyte molecule. That sugar is the carrier of it. It's the transport. So
It definitely helps. Yeah, it can.
without the sugar, how
I mean,
it seems like it
yeah,
would inhibit the body's ability
you're still able to absorb it. It's just
to deliver it.
the sugar does kinda help with that. So it's not like if you just take in the sodium, it's not. It's just that there's it helps facilitate that a little bit more. So it's just, yeah, thinking of it that way. I mean, not only that, not just sugar for that piece though too. When people are doing like sugar free, or they're like, I'm not going to consume carbs or something or any sugar, and they're just relying on solids or I don't know, like some of those starches, like super starches that aren't necessarily sugar. I think that, yeah, I mean, those types of products don't really actually help absorption. It's actually the sort of more simple sugars that do. So there's a piece there. And also, like, yeah, that works. I mean, you can kind of do some of those starches, then maybe you're like trying to, but if you're trying to avoid sugar altogether, I mean, I think, I do agree. I think there is a benefit there of the sugar for actually getting the hydration piece, but also like, I think sometimes people benefit a little bit from having like that fast acting glucose or fructose or whatever combination of like simple sugars they're consuming that kind of get right into the system and give you immediate fuel with some balance of some sort of like super starch or slow digesting carb, and kind of balancing those two out, because the research really does show. I don't see any research that says going into a workout or race and not consuming enough sugar or carbs is beneficial. Like I don't see that. And a lot of those low carb, like keto studies they've done have not shown that there's any benefit to doing low carb in performance. And in fact, there's some detriment. So it's like to try to maximize how much sugar you're able to absorb is also really important too. Like how much carbs you're able to absorb, to try to figure that out. Like how much can you get? It may not be as much as the pros, but it's like trying to figure that out is great, because the more carbs you can tolerate, the better your performance. And that is really what the literature is showing. That's why there's so many athletes like maximizing their carb intake. And just some of the amounts are very, very high and maybe more than you'll be able to take. But so it's not just the absorption of the fluid, but also thinking of it like the performance itself. And there's a couple things that carbs are doing more than just fueling us. They're also helping with our hydration too, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's why also we want to try to have, I mean, I don't know. I think we kind of touched on that quite well. I mean, I'm trying to see if there's anything in our notes that maybe about the carbs that I would want to add, but I think that's.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that I understood the role of sugar in the delivering of electrolytes into the body, and the body uses the sugar to help absorption or facilitate it or make it easier. So without the sugar, it seems like it would be harder for the body to absorb the nutrient. So why make things harder?
Yeah, so if we want to get sciencey about it, I was just looking at some of my notes here, but it's like the small intestine, there is an actual co-transporter. So basically we have transporters in the gut that transport nutrients from the gut into the bloodstream, right? And there's a co-transporter that's called SGLT1 transporters. So those of you want to get sciencey. And they actually co-transport glucose with sodium. And so the glucose and the sodium together, along with water, they kind of help facilitates that. And so it's why oftentimes it pulls water into the bloodstream a bit quicker. So that's why a lot of the sports drinks contain both, because that does help, especially during exercise. Like you probably don't need to be doing that sugar with the sodium in your daily hydration, because you don't, still, the sodium still helps with the hydration piece and getting it into the cells of our body. But this is just talking about like what's happening in the gut. And so there is a little bit of a faster absorption when we have those two together. And that's important during exercise, because we're trying to facilitate that getting those nutrients as quickly as we can into our system. And the longer it sits in the gut, the more problems we might have, gut issues, and the less likely it's to get quickly to where it needs to go, right? So kind of thinking of it that way. And it's just a little bit more slow with the glucose, either the glucose by itself or the glucose without the sodium. So we do want to kind of think about, okay, is there a way we can kind of get a little bit of both of these? But again, we don't want to overload the gut too much. And so it's just sort of finding, that's why I think sometimes fueling and having the electrolytes and the fuel kind of often, and you're having to kind of, you don't want to load like, oh, I'm going to do all my hydration and all of my carbs at once and then not, you kind of almost have to be constantly drinking or fueling. Unfortunately, I know that gets to be a bummer, but especially during a race, you're constantly kind of having to be thinking about that and trying to like spread it out a little bit so that you're having that benefit of getting the sodium and the carb or the sugar, but not overloading the gut too much. Because unfortunately, and I don't want to be like get people real confused or be like, oh, well, how do I figure that out? But it's more about just some sort of, balancing of those two and trying to get that, kind of fueling with the, like, for instance, I guess I could give an example. You could take, like, maybe you start your race, or let's say it's like a marathon or a run, just to keep it simple. And, you have the aid stations every couple of miles and you're taking in the fluid. And then maybe you do you take in some carbs with that, but, ideally maybe you would be having fluid in between or some sort of electrolyte also in between, and you could be like drinking that, and then you would get every few miles you would be maybe taking in like a gel, or every 30 minutes you would be taking in a gel and a little bit of electrolyte, but then in between maybe you would want to take in a little more concentrated electrolytes with a little bit of sugar in it, so some kind of mix, you know what I mean? So you're kind of like
Yeah.
spacing it out throughout the whole run instead of, oh, well, it's really hard during a marathon because you have those aid stations every few miles, and you're trying to but that's why they space it out like that, right? Because every few miles you get a chance to have a little hydration and maybe a little bit of fuel, and you're not trying to get all of that in one setting every hour. It's happening every mile or two, right? So thinking of it that way, you want to spread it all out and not try to get all 90 grams of carbs in that
Well, yeah, you
one
can
sitting, right?
think of it as like a rainstorm. So if
Mhm.
you can have a situation where, a storm blows in and it just dumps buckets of water, in one shot. Well, what happens is that you get flooding, and it's like, ditches fill up, and the streets flood. But you take that same situation, the same volume of water that came in that rainstorm in the span of like 10
The
minutes,
volume of everything
now
else, right?
spread that out over like
And it
multiple
absorbs
hours.
into
The
and it's
ground
absorbing into
absorbs
the
it,
ground. Yeah.
and you don't have the same kind of situation. Think of it
Mhm.
that way.
Yeah,
It's
that's
like
a good way to think of it, yeah.
consuming all of your carbs in one shot is like a massive
Or
downpour of a
or even
rain.
all of your hydration in one
Yes.
shot. You're just,
Yep.
like, loading it. Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. It's like you're kinda spreading out, allowing the absorption to happen a little more over time, and then you don't have to worry too much, about the concentration of anything in that sense, because you're probably not overloading your body or your gut with
Yes.
too much. I do wanna touch on the sodium piece and kind of how to calculate that before we forget, because I
Yeah.
just think we've talked a lot about sodium. So I just wanna mention that the range in general for people, this is a big range. So people can range from anywhere from as low as like maybe 300 or 400 milligrams per liter of sodium up to as high, like a highly salty sweater might be like 1.5 or even a slightly higher milligrams per liter. So this is how much you're losing per liter of sweat. And so this is why I mean, sometimes, like you're out there and you're like, I am covered in sweat. I have a hat on and it's like salty, you get
Yeah.
in the shower like I do and I'm like tasting it. I'm more of a moderately salty sweater, or, and some people are very salty sweaters. So you kind of know, and you can kind of, if you just want to use that, it's fine. But if you really kind of want to get an idea, there's a couple things you can do. One I found that's very inexpensive and it's not as precise, but it gives you a fairly good idea, is the sweat sodium patches that you can get from Gatorade. I think the last time I got them, they were on sale for like $12.50. Like, so it was $24 for 2 patches, and there's a little app and you download it, and basically it does a little bit of calculation for you. You tell it like how, I think you have to I think you have to put in there like how hot it is. It gives like a little bit of a temperature thing, and then or the dew point or something. And then you have to um put the patch on, and ideally maybe you would also be weighing yourself before and after. And then I think you just go out and you run or do your exercise. It's not going to work very well for probably the pool.
Yeah.
That's where it's a little, but if you know how much you're generally losing in the run or the bike, you could probably generalize that to the swim, since the swim is, you're not going to be taking in anything during the swim anyways, and it's not the biggest portion of a triathlon, or so it's probably okay. But just to give you an idea, while you're actually swimming in practice, you may just want to use whatever information you get from the run and the bike, because it's the patch is just going to fall off in the water. That's the only
Yeah.
thing. I think maybe they have ways to calculate it for swimming that I are more advanced. But so what you do is just wear it, and then when you get back, you scan it and with the app, and it kind of gives you an idea. It's like a range. So it's like moderately salty might be like 500 to 800 or something like that, or 700 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. Then it might be like high if you're high, so it's giving you a range. It's not like an exact number, but that's, I think, enough, right? Because then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go somewhere in the middle of that, and I want to aim for, it's telling me I'm, a moderately salty sweater. So maybe I want to aim for a minimum of like 500 milligrams per liter. And if you're losing, let's say, 3 liters, I don't know, you could start, or like maybe it's really hot and you're losing 3 liters for a certain amount of time, then you can kind of know how much sodium you need to be, consuming per liter of fluid, or how much you need to add in. And just keep in mind, like, if you're like, well, that seems like a lot, you still be sort of on the lower end of that. Like, you're like, well, that's a lot. I'm just going to do 500 milligrams per liter or something like that. Like, unless you're doing like a really, really, really long race, like the body, you're probably going to end the race a little bit lower in sodium, but it probably won't have a hugely negative impact on performance as long as you're not significantly low. But I think that's just a really good way of trying. And again, like I said, if you're a little bit on the high end, or slightly on the low end, the body has this way of dealing with that. So it just gives you an idea of like how much you need, and you can do it in different conditions. And you get buy 4 of those salt sweat patches and try them in various different temperatures and different conditions on the bike versus the run, and just use that. And it gives you a bit of an idea. And if you do it several times, it can give you a little bit more of an idea of how it might differ, but depending on the temperature or something like that. And that's just a very easy way to do it. But there are like places you can go and actually have this done. So if you Google like sweat sodium analysis, there's labs, and like, I can't remember the name of it, or there's like ones you can buy that are more precise, I think, like these patches type of things that you can wear and determine it. So and actually in a lab, I think they determine it a little bit differently. They're being very much more precise. So if you're like, I really want to know, like, I want to know exactly, like, it costs a lot more to do the lab,
Well, yeah.
obviously. So you have options, but I think just getting an idea, and then you can know generally what you're losing, and then you can know in general, like, basically at least what you need to get to replace it, or at the low end at the very minimum. And that's a great way to do it. You don't have to be super precise. So I just wanted to mention that because there is a large variation in how much somebody might lose, and it does have a lot to depend on basically it's probably a lot of genetics, but there are other things like age and altitude and humidity and heat, and all this stuff can really affect it. So you just maybe try it in a few different settings, and you get a little bit of an idea, and that's probably good enough in my opinion. I don't know about you. Have you ever done any sort of sweat sodium
I've never
analysis?
done the sodium testing. I've done a couple sweat tests, but I haven't really done anything with them. I was just kind of curious about it. So you and I can probably chat about that.
Yeah. If you're interested, I think
Yeah.
yeah, otherwise you're just
It
kind
was
of
a good
like guessing,
experiment.
right? You're
It was
like,
kind of a pain in the butt, though. I mean, honestly.
yeah,
So it's just like you're weighing yourself, and then it's just
it
like,
is a
okay,
pain.
now I got to measure like all the water that I'm taking
Mhm.
out with me, and how much did I come back with, and it can get a little bit, kind of wear on you a little bit. It's like food
Yeah.
logging. You can only do
Yeah.
with so much of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it all
So
the time. I mean,
yeah,
you don't want to you're doing the exercise for fun. Like, you don't want to make it a big chore. But I think to do it, in general, it's not going to change too much. I mean, maybe a little bit as we age and stuff, but like, it just depends a little bit on the temperature. So you might want to just do it a few times at different temperatures, and then maybe at a different run versus bike and things like that. But then once you have that general idea, you could just use that. And same with the sodium stuff. Like, once you just kind of have, oh, I'm actually, wow, I'm a really salty sweater. Sometimes that you're like, I know this because I can taste it, I can see it. So I'm going to aim on the higher end of, the ranges or something. And that's fine
yeah,
too. But I just think sometimes it helps to have like an actual sort of idea, like a closer estimate of what you need. And yeah, and once you do it, you don't have to keep doing it all the time, every time. That's a tedious, right?
yeah,
So it's just something to kind of give you a baseline idea, and then you kind of take it and run with it. And then, maybe every once in a while check in and see if it's changed. Yeah. So don't think it's something like food logging that you got to do every time or every day. Not that
yeah.
you have to log every day, but it is tedious. Hey, everybody. This is Katie from the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. And I am just here to tell you that we are actually splitting this podcast into 2 parts. So we have part 1 that you just listened to, and we are actually going to release part 2 next week. The reason we were doing this is that the podcast was actually about 2 hours long, and we wanted to be respectful of everyone's time. So hopefully you'll tune in next week for part 2, and we'll talk a lot more in depth about some other topics related to hydration, such as caffeine and kind of how to put it all together, all this information together for like a plan for race day and for fueling in general. So hopefully you'll tune in next week. Thanks again. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have a Facebook group. So we have the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast group on Facebook. And both Justin and I have our own businesses where we offer coaching, and me personally, I do nutrition counseling. So we do offer those services. I am at fuel2run.com. So www.fuel2 and then run.com. And Justin is at tabularasaracing.com. So if you want to get a hold of us, you can do it either contacting us personally, or you can go ahead and try to contact us on our podcast email, and that is going to be the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast at gmail.com. And so go ahead and get a hold of us if you have any questions, and definitely leave us a review. If you like the podcast, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you all next week.
Listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Feel free to leave us up to a 5-star review on iTunes and Spotify, because leaving a review really helps others like you find us. Visit the podcast website for other episodes of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast at enduranceathletejourney.buzzsprout.com. Have questions or comments about the podcast? Send Coach Justin and Kate an email at theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. For all things coaching, visit Coach Katie at fuel2run.com and Coach Justin at tabularasaracing.com. Again, thank you for listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and remember to find joy in the journey.